I'd like to welcome Dr. Howard Teich to our program today. And I've known Howard for, wow, 2 decades now. We met out in Silicon Valley in a venture capital pitch. And he is somebody who really showed me what mastery means in the context of a shared experience. He turned that first meeting on Sand Hill Road in venture capital. There's a tremendous amount of pretension and artifice. And I found that Howard really shifted the dynamics till it was almost like an encounter group. People saw each other, heard each other. And what I saw was almost like a slowing down of time so that the words resonated, like in the Matrix, having bullet time for words, where words resonated and people became more human. Um, so my first question, Howard, is just a very simple one. How do you
Well,
do that?
that's so interesting that you remembered that way, because at that time, I imagine, although I didn't have the word for it, I was practicing radical empathy. Because if you have radical empathy for somebody who is in an adrenaline journey to be reductionistic, like venture capitalists usually are, then it changes the time frame from into what I call lunar time, or the wave and particle time, the wave time. And when you're in the wave time, you're in a different experience of time. And we've talked often about speed to reality. And speed in lunar time is a different experience than speed in solar time. One is adrenaline and the other is endorphins. And so when you really are listening and have radical empathy for somebody else's point of view, and you're not trying to get anything other than engaging, it really changes the experience of time and
Hmm.
space.
So that's really interesting. The not wanting to get something and really participating. There's a term that you've used in our coaching quite a bit, which is not being attached to outcomes or being unattached to outcomes. How does that fit with this dynamic?
Well, it's very interesting because, a lot of these days people are learning to meditate and be witnessing, not attached. And when the ego gets attached, it tends to be ego driven. When you're witnessing, you have this other part of the person called the self, which is really the unconscious and its subconscious and unconscious elements. And so you're present in what we call the ego self axis. There's actually a dotted line between the ego and the self. And when you're in attachment to an outcome, you're much more in ego and a different brainwave state. And when you're attached, you're not going to be listening to intuition and the unconscious. And sometimes that's appropriate, particularly in ending a project where you definitely want to be focused and be watching the time frame. But most people operate, and this is one of the traps, I think, of Western culture, is that you're supposed to have an object, supposed to have an objective, a goal. And when I do, coaching, particularly in big businesses or corporations, and I say, well, let go of the goal and go for the vision, because then you include the goal as a subset of the vision. But if you go for the vision, you're in this other part of the psyche, which is the ego and the self in alignment. And you have a much broader view and access to different energies and different information and different stories. So to let go of the object, the ego object, is not an easy thing to do, because most people won't do it. And if they do it, they're thinking they're compromising and they're copping out and they're not being successful. Where actually, if you learn to surrender to the unconscious and in the moment, and you have this other point of view, because really the conscious mind is a subset of the unconscious. It was born at some stage of evolution, probably about 1000 BC, when monotheism came about. And when you really have the bigger picture of both and, rather than the ego and the self separated by a lack of an axis but an alienation, you have both voices there when you surrender, where only you'll have the ego voice there when you're driven towards a goal.
Wow. Wow. How do you, in particularly in big corporations, but also just individual coaching with executives, how do you support people going through the anxiety that probably comes up frequently when you ask somebody to surrender or to be unattached to outcomes, when that's so much part of their view of their success is drivenness and
Well, some people will do it, some people won't. And when the person doesn't do it, I'm not attached to whether they do it or not. So it doesn't matter to me because I know I've learned that if I talk to their unconscious and their ego, then the unconscious gets it. And that's what counts because it's the unconscious that informs the ego, even though the ego usually won't admit that. So if somebody's attached to it, that's fine. And if they're not, we'll have a quicker conversation that they're likely to get it anyway, because if they've decided they want coaching, they're open to something, whether they're resistant or not, it doesn't really matter to me.
so that actually to me explains speed to reality, that the quicker you actually can let go of those ego attachments, the
Right,
faster you're on board with reality, which the unconscious understands at a much deeper and broader level.
right, right. And there's a different time frame because the unconscious operates in cycles. And most of the cells in life are in biorhythms. They're not in goal directed behavior, even though they have points of modulation and outcome. But it's not driven by a exact point that you have to get an ROI by the 30th day of December or you lose your bonus. So when you really have this other consciousness, also not instead of, but a both and consciousness, you really have a much broader view and you don't lose this other view. And it takes a little while. Some people get it just like that, and some people it takes a while, but if you stay at it, it's part of the neurobiology of life. It's not a cultural phenomenon. It's actually pre-culture. As indigenous cultures had this wisdom, goes back to at least the birth of the Homo sapien and their survivor, that they dealt with the environment and natures and what's now called epigenetics. Environmental signals determine their reactions rather than only ego. And sometimes when you go, they had to go out for the hunt, and that was part of it. They did it by rhythms, not by just, oh, I'm going to go find that animal, because that didn't get them there. They usually made too much noise getting there and tripped over themselves, and the animal ran away. So they usually did it in this other time, this lunar time, this moon time, as the indigenous cultures called it, which is a different cycle than the solar time, which is a cyclical time, but of a 24-hour cycle as opposed to a 28-day or 30-day cycle of nature.
Hmm. You know, that concept of the both and when you talk about wave and particle, um, that's complementarity, which you bring in a lot. And since we've been working together, I almost always find whenever a concept comes up, I look for the complement and ensure that it's consciously included. Because I found that if there's a compliment that's ignored or suppressed or rejected, it'll find a way to come
Right,
back in.
it attacks. And
Yep.
that's kind of the contemporary problem right now in the world, is that it's not in complement, it's a battle of opposites. This group versus that, this Republicans versus Democrats, you name it. The world has been split, thanks to Trump, into really the extremes that it has been there underlying, because Western consciousness has had objects, not relationships. And so the paradigm switch that an individual can make, particularly as a leader or an individual in an intimate relationship, if you're coming from this bigger concept of both and, you really change the person's experience, particularly if you're not attached to their behaving a certain way and have empathy, and you just stay there and you don't get attached to an ego battle of opposites, which is really what the world is battling right now. Is a battle of opposites where that's really an ego battle as opposed to a battle that includes the ego but is driven by the unconscious and nature. Because the unconscious is nature, it is the body. And the ego is just a little manifestation that's gotten inflated.
So interesting. Since the very beginning, as that we've talked, there's a concept that you've brought up of sacrificing the ego. And I'm really interested in that relationship between sacrifice and surrender and
Yeah,
how
yeah.
those work together.
Well, it's a sacrifice of the inflated ego, not the ego. That's the trick, because most of us haven't learned. We've tried to evolve. We do evolve, whether we like it or not. And when the ego is ruling, which is most of education, is to develop ego. It's not to remember the both and. It's to remember and develop the ego, which is a necessary stage and it's crucial. But it becomes an inflated ego because it tries to do, and which is often the same thing as a deflated ego. Low self-esteem is a form of ego deflation, which comes when you don't usually meet your idealized fantasies of the grade you're supposed to get, or what your parents want, or what your culture wants, or what you want, and you inflate that and tend to lose perspective of wholeness and really go for a target identity only and forget the both and dynamic. So it's not sacrificing the ego, it's sacrificing the inflated ego to bring it back in alignment with the unconscious and have a relationship between the two, because the ego is birthed out of nature and the unconscious. It doesn't rule no matter what we've been brainwashed to think. So it's not
Yeah,
sacrificing the ego, it's the inflated or deflated ego. Most of us
right.
have deflation because we don't match the idealized fantasies of others, and we don't have enough self esteem to realize that they're doing a hypnotic trip on us about what they want from us, not who we are.
Mm. That's so brilliantly stated. The
Tortur-
compliment,
Torturously, not brilliant, torturously figured out.
yeah. Well, the result is brilliant, even though the journey
That's
was
because
no
you
doubt
that's
torturous.
because you can surrender your ego. So you can listen
S-
and relate.
Surrender my inflated and deflated ego.
Right, me too. Me too.
Yeah,
Never stopped.
yeah,
There's some
yeah.
ego that wants to rule and be king or queen. Doesn't matter men or women.
Well, the archetypal complement that's really emerged strongly for me that I use in all my work now is the leader guide. And when you talk about rulers, you we talk about executives and the executive function, the importance of that.
Yeah.
The the guide really became important to me many years ago. I think it was probably 2004. It's what, 16 years ago. We were talking about this. I just started really getting deeply into ceremony.
Yep. It
Um,
shows up as the inner wisdom, the inner shaman, and, and the outer chief, or what's the word you use? Guide and
a leader guide.
leader. The
Yeah,
leader
yeah,
is the chief, and the guide's the shaman, and they work together in that twinning pair. And that's the beauty of having both and. That's a beautiful example, David.
exactly. And I just remember the moment where I was talking about this person who was supporting me in ceremony and about a path, and you said, um, just stay open to your other guides. You don't want to miss the quantum physics guide and the, sugar cereal guide. I don't remember the examples
All
you
the
used, but
archetypes of the
right,
round table of the psyche,
right,
and
right.
not be fragmented and just go on one trip and forget the rest because they'll hound you. They'll come back.
Exactly.
You don't get away
Exactly.
from them, no matter how much your ego wants to, until you surrender and be part of the group, be part of the tribe. Yep.
Right. Over identification is something that I've really learned. I can see in a meeting, in a moment, in a session, when someone is over identified with a particular archetype or guide and really attached to that, and they're not seeing all the others swirling around them trying to get their attention.
Well, that's such an interesting thing because once you get this inside, you get to witness this outside in others. And if you're not attached to an outcome, you can watch all this happen as a movie and then step in with radical empathy. If you step in with the ego, they'll battle you. But if you step in with empathy, then you're part of their drama and their metaphor system, their way, and then they're open to listen to you after you acknowledge their point of view. But hardly anybody's open to hear the other until they get acknowledged, until that narcissistic ego gets acknowledged. And I would say the same for myself. I have to watch my narcissistic ego wanting acknowledgement and slow it down and give the other one empathy first. And then they're much more open and will almost always listen to you. But if you try to talk them out of their point of view or don't acknowledge it or bring up to the opposite, as is most conversations, is a battle of opposites, not a battle of evolution and empathy. And it ends up to be a stalemate of another conversation that went nowhere with no different outcome than the same old thing that happened last time you tried to have a conversation. It's like so amazing in couples. When I do a lot of couples therapy, oh my God, it's like there's a battle for ego and not a battle for understanding. And they end up with the same repetitive addiction to the same fight. Oh, who's going to do the dishes or whatever the object is, it doesn't matter. And if you don't do this other thing, you're just in a stale, circle repetitive masturbation dynamic.
Exactly.
I think you're
Well,
actually relating to the other.
yeah, I mean, that's also something I learned from you, which is that people want to be seen and heard more than anything else. So,
Once you're seen and heard, to listen.
yeah,
Usually,
and yeah, well, I've really found that as when even in just 20-minute rapid coaching sessions that I do, and I just do these for free, I hear people say I got more out of that
you know,
20 minutes
yeah,
than
it's amazing. That's
I've
really
gotten from
cool.
all of this searching on the
Right,
internet, all these
yeah,
courses I've taken, all these other people I've worked with, and it's really because it's what I do. I just listen really deeply. I see what
right,
they're really expressing, and then I hold that
yeah,
up,
yeah,
and once they see, wow, this person got me more than I got myself, now I'm
right,
actually seeing and
yeah,
hearing myself,
yeah,
because that's the real challenge. Like, people sort of believe they want other people to see and hear them,
right,
but very much it's really just sort of a cry to themselves,
yeah,
like, know me, pay attention to me, the real
yeah.
me, the authentic me,
Yeah,
not this me that's been put on me
yeah.
by all of these other people.
So you're bringing up this really deep subject of these mirror neurons.
Mm,
And basically, when you're in that, you're mirroring back to the other themselves. And so that's the difference what narcissists couldn't do when he or she looked in the pool was they fell in love with their own fantasy and didn't have reflective consciousness. And the same thing is that when you don't have reflective consciousness back to another, they're not going to have it back to you. And if you do have it to the other, it doesn't really matter if they don't have it back because there's a different magic that goes on in that communication. But the real magic of what you're describing is that by having these mirror neurons, which are the learning neurons they found in almost all animals, in almost all parts of the psyche by actually seeing and copying and imitating learning, not by having to do it all yourself, which is the unfortunate Western model of the hero or the heroine has to do it all themselves rather than in this mirroring. Then you have the whole psyche at a cellular level involved in learning and teaching and remembering and reacting again. And that's the beauty of how a few minutes in this space can take hours and make a radical difference in the person trusting you. Because once you really see the other, they're willing to trust you in a way that they can't unless they know you have their back. And if you don't have an ego agenda, because it doesn't work if you do this manipulatively, it just breaks apart and makes it worse. So by having a really heartfelt, holistic mindset, it really creates a trust and a dynamic. And then people will really open up to you because people are starved to be seen and heard and not to be ego tripped and told how to be and what to do or just not listened to and somebody saying, well, yes, but.
Yeah, the there's so much as I've really immersed myself in the current culture of coaching and selling and marketing and all that, so much of it goes back to this 1937 book, Think and Grow Rich. And
Mhm.
it's all built on Napoleon Hill's, NLP, all of these different things that fundamentally are rooted in manipulation, influence, and
Right.
persuasion.
Yeah.
And I've really seen what you do and bring forward
Mhm.
is based on empowerment, support, and guidance, where you're really providing a truly safe space where someone can go through the transformation that they're really
Well, thanks
seeking.
for the compliment. That's as deep as it gets. I really appreciate that. That's what my intent is.
Well, and you do this a lot through archetype and myth. And you just mentioned narcissists and
Yeah.
narcissus. And to me, I always remember the the work we did where you talked about echo, and
Right.
to me, this good, having been a philosophy major, I just love all these compliments that come out, like between Narcissus is looking at his reflection, whereas Echo is
Right.
the sound coming back. And that all goes back to this really core archetype. Can you talk about the
Yeah.
solar and lunar and why
Sure.
for you that's really the central foundational grounding
Yeah.
archetype?
Help me stay on track here, and I don't get off. So, just to start, where you're introducing the concept of echo. If your listeners or viewers probably remember, if you look at a picture of narcissist in the water, looking at the water, which is the most common picture, there's a female figure sitting on a rock outside, and her name is actually Echo. And Echo got her name because she was actually part of the matriarch. She was part of Hera, Zeus's wife's um, feminine. And because she betrayed Hera when she didn't tell Hera that Zeus was having an affair, her curse was to be able to only echo back what it was that she heard. She didn't have any reflective consciousness. So she's actually kind of this is the male version of narcissism. There's a female version too, which is a complement to this, but I'll stay with the story that because it's a non-gender story, but let's use the imagery there. And so when she, of course, she's perfectly there because earlier in the narcissist story, where he's looking for the idealized fantasy relationship with the perfect woman, or other versions, it was the perfect man, that gay or straight doesn't really, or bi doesn't really matter. There's this addiction to perfection and then rejecting whoever comes along because of too this or too that, too much hair, not enough muscle, too fat, too thin. It doesn't matter because it doesn't need this idealized perfectionistic fantasy in the brain of the seeker. So, of course, everybody got rejected in the narcissist myth, except she looked in the water and fell in love with his or her own fantasy. And so, of course, Echo lost her voice because she betrayed, and Echo back didn't have a personality. And most relationships have this dynamic of narcissism and one the other one being the Echo not being able to influence because they've been quieted or so forth. Well, that's this particular myth. But the bottom line for me was my torturous discovery of many years of Jungian analysis, which I had about 15 years at that point. I started in my 30s, early 30s, and I'm in 48. And I'd had become the world's best. I spent most of my time in San Francisco at that point in my life. And San Francisco had the world's best Jungian analysts. And I was attracted to dreams and the unconscious. And therefore, they were the only ones to really seek out. And I had the honor of finding some of the world's best, even a man who was in analysis with Carl Jung, a guy named Joe Henderson, who died at 104, working till the day he died, wrote, and was amazingly well known, and an alchemist in that he had studied Jung's famous contribution alchemy. So after all the Jungian analysis, because there were these frankly suicides in my family, my mother and brother, I'm in my late 40s, and for men, it's to develop their feminine side. That's the goal. And I say goal on purpose in the binary world of most modern psychology. Although Jung wasn't necessarily there, the model that has, he said, I'm glad I'm Carl Jung and not Jungians, because the Jungians have more codified the model of the anima for men and the animus, the masculine side of women. So here I am in my late 40s. I had had hope that I could figure this out. And here I'm in a basically despair for that really felt like there's nothing else to do. And I saw this movie, which I think most of the people have not seen, called The Kiss of the Spider Woman with Raul Julia and William Hurt in 19 is mid 80s, and they won the Academy Award for this movie. And it was about these two men locked in a prison cell, one one a very effeminate gay man, and the other a very macho heterosexual, and they became friends, even though they were opposites. And they each died the other one's death, and one died as the gay guy died carrying the political message, and was the destiny of the straight guy. And the straight guy died in a boat with a romantic fantasy because all he had was sex with women. He couldn't have relationships because his relationship was with the revolution. And I wondered at that moment if they had known that they were each part of each other, if they would have had a different fate. So I wondered who Spider Woman was in the story because it wasn't clear. And a friend of mine who had written a book called Navajo Symbols and Healing, I remembered she was a figure in that story. And he wrote back and said, she's the mother of twin heroes. And I had never heard of twin heroes. Absolutely was. I had studied Jung and Campbell and the hero with a thousand faces and you name it. And I'd never heard of twin heroes. And I looked it up in the back of mythology books, and almost every culture had male twins. And I was shocked. And I started my research. What did this really mean to somebody in 1985 and my late 40s? Very successful private practice, not very good relationships with women. And I eventually found that the great story that Joseph Campbell actually wrote about, where the two come to their father, before 1943, he wrote this monograph that was of the Navajo twin heroes. And the Navajo twin heroes, I'd never heard of them. And this was before Hero with a Thousand Faces, which somewhere he and the world has interpreted into the single hero rather than the twin hero. And I found that every culture, pre-Judeo Christian culture, indigenous cultures had twin male heroes and twin female heroines, not a single hero, single heroine. And I finally figured out that in the Mayan story, where the twins played ball in the ball court, if any of your viewers have been down in the Yucatan, they probably visited Chichen Itza, where was the center of the Mayan ceremonies. They would play this ball game, and if you won, you lived, and if you didn't, you died. So it was a serious game in those cultures. And so I wondered who, so the twins who are called down to the underworld because they're creating so much noise with their success that the gods and goddesses of the underworld call them down laughing, well, we'll take care of them. Come down here and we'll play the ball game with you. And we know who will win. But however, to their surprise, the twins actually defeated the Lords of Death and they actually, but realized they're mortal and they had to jump into a fire. And one was born as the sun and one was born in the moon. I said, wow, I've never heard of the male moon god because it wasn't part of Jung's contribution. And every other culture had twins, except Western culture had the twins, and one Romulus kills Remus. So Western culture didn't have the lunar masculine, and the world has labeled it the feminine side of men and the women the masculine side, rather than within your own gender having the sun and moon, nature, and it's ultimate because the sun is the source of everything in this cosmos, west in in our Milky Way cosmos on Earth, and the moon is its reflective twin, and they work together in the tides and in many things. They just are complementary, they're not opposites. And that culture has divided them to opposites rather than complementarity. And then I eventually realized that complementarity was the secret of the mystical underworld of quantum physics, of the wave and the particle, and that the solar was the wave and the lunar was the particle, or that is actually called the field these days, rather than the wave, the field and the particle. And as Einstein said, the wave is the sole governing agent of the particle. The wave, the lunar leads, this solar comes out of the lunar. That magic of reversing what I learned and understanding complementarity and twinning, and that almost everything from the Big Bang on, including radiation, was wave and particle. And that's what I really built my life trying to understand, learn, and teach whenever I get the addiction to share it with others, such as your listeners and you. So the wave and the particle, or the field and the particle is determined by the wave or the field. The field turns into the particle when you observe it and where your attention goes. And if you have agile attention or not caught in a narcissistic point of view, you have much more likelihood to have a different complementarity and symmetry between the wave and the particle. So so you see this twinning in female mythology and male mythology. Western culture has killed it. That's why indigenous cultures and our friend Four Arrows are so absolutely crucial to understand this different relationship with nature as opposed to dominating nature. So
Mm,
that's that's sort of a
beautiful.
story of the long version of this. And
No,
narcissists
that's
didn't have that. We don't, when in that narcissistic ego, whether we're man or woman, it doesn't matter. We're trying to control, science, the original principles of science were to control nature. Now they've learned differently with epigenetics and are revisioning what happens. But if you take some data and you reduce it to a solar point of view, you're going to call that the law of nature, as Newton did. If you see it as not an object, but as part of the context, as part of nature's story, not all of nature's story.
beautiful. Well, there are so many possible threads and directions to go from that, but one I'd like to pick up is the concept of alchemy that you mentioned.
Sure.
And we read several books together, two by Edward Edinger, where, and just for the audience, this was the order that Howard recommended them, and it really worked for me, is reading the introduction to uh, the anatomy of the psyche, and then reading ego and archetype, and then going back and
I was very wise to do that.
yeah,
Yeah. Well,
and then going back and reading the rest.
Edward Edinger was a Jungian analyst who died about 5 or 7 years ago, and it's very hard to read Jung unless you're an addict. Although memories, dreams, and reflections, Jung is worth the read, but most people won't do the work. And Edward Edinger was one of the many brilliant Jungian analysts who was a great writer and explained it. And he wrote, so what happened to alchemy when Jung, after he broke up with Freud from this complicated relationship, and it went into this very complicated period, he, in the early 1912 to 1917, it was in the First World War, and he was just miserable trying to figure out why he and Freud, because Freud was a father figure to Jung, and they were very close until one moment when they were traveling together in the United States. They were interpreting each other's dreams, and Freud, which was very reductionistic and felt everything was driven by sexuality, and Jung had a different interpretation. And Freud actually thought that Jung was trying to castrate him and dismantle him by having another theory. And so Jung went, he finally broke off that relationship because he realized to be himself, he had to end it. But it was very traumatic in a way that only somebody who's your father figure, when you have a weak father that Jung did, and Freud was so internationally known, and Jung was pretty amazing, but not at the level Freud was. And Freud was older and had these groups of psychoanalysts around him. He went into this dark period, and in the middle of it, he figured out that he had a series of dreams that said for him to buy all these alchemy books that were in Latin and Greek, which he did. They were not alchemy books at that point; were kind of like comic books. Nobody really felt they were anything. And what Jung did then was he began to study them. He had a very amazing woman, Marie Louise von Franz, which was his partner, younger woman. I think she actually was 18 years old at that point, but she knew Latin and Greek, and so she started translating these books into German at that point. And Jung began to be able to read them and understand them and the symbolism. He began to find the same images and symbols were in his clients' dreams. And that was really shocking to him because he was a scientist, Freud was a scientist in the best sense of the words back then. And he had to prove that there was something called the collective unconscious, that it was more than just the sexual drive that was driving us as humans. And so he began to see that the collective unconscious, he began to see that it was carried forward unconsciously in the mindset of the alchemists, which go back at least to certainly Greek and Roman times. I think it goes back to the beginning of the fire carriers, 500,000 BC, and the transformations that happened with fire and how the brain grew because of food and cooking and all that kind of stuff. But he began to see that the alchemists had the symbols of the unconscious that they were unconscious of because they didn't have the modern ego and were unconsciously projecting the unconscious mind through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and he began to see those same symbols. And so that began to be, I think, his great, spent the last 30 years of his life writing about psychology and alchemy as the collective unconscious. And Edward Edinger, in The Anatomy of the Psyche, spends, I think it's the first 30 pages explaining how Jung and the concept of alchemy was what Jung discovered. And active imagination, which is now the kind of the biggest thing going, is intentions and visioning, really started when Jung realized that what the alchemists were doing was having active imagination. They were not necessarily seeking gold, although many were. They were called puffers, but that the real alchemists were on for transformation of themselves and others, and they were healers and bankers and kings and queens because they were the only ones that really could afford that equipment and had the courage in the Middle Ages, which was very anti-alchemy. Many of them were burned at the stakes and hunted, but they had to have the resources. And one of the beautiful things I gleamed onto was alchemy, as far as I know, is the only tradition that spirit and matter are complementary, not one or the other. And most of us need to have the alchemy of matter and in life and a relationship to our evolutionary spiritual side, our invisible side, to work together and for transformation. And many people have either too much matter or too much, like many artists have the lunar down, the field down, and their art emerges, but they don't really have the relationship to the solar alchemy. and that having this alchemical balance is complementarity, which is what the quantum physics realized. So then, if you read the other book, Ego and Archetype, that Edinger wrote, which is the other book that Dave is referring to, you can get one of the best starts to Jungian understanding. Those two books together bring the latter day Jung and the earlier Jung together in a brilliant way. And then there's so many other great writers who've written about Jung, who's now coming out alive again in this era that being discovered. And what I find is that most younger people don't have any of this baggage. They're already there. They live in the wave particle complementarity. They're not caught in this masculine, feminine, patriarchal definition. And there's really hope in so many of the younger people I notice have just living this way. And if they don't sell out as they get older and have families or lovers and get too much money and really keep that spirit up, there really is a chance for this to go on. If it falls back, as I saw the hippies do in San Francisco, and just sell out to materialism eventually and forget where they started, then it will be the same old cycle of materialism and a new form of patriarch or matriarch. You never know which one's going to win this time, or some form of it work rather than complementarity of both ends. So Jung and alchemy, it's the core of understanding the archetypes and understanding how the unconscious works. By far, best of all, nobody comes close to Jung and the archetypal psychology, because when you get out of the gender thing of the anima and the animus, you're really into quantum physics and archetypal psychology, not necessarily Jung's point of view, but Jung is the guide there for most of us. And then if we can let go of this binary, this is male and this is female, there's a chance to live in this quantum state of the alchemists do unconsciously. And I worked with an artist yesterday, a 33-year-old guy, who amazingly does this because he's not caught in the patriarch, but struggling with, he's got a very successful design business, and can I find enough time for my spiritual side? Am I going to let down my clients? Oh, I'm already struggling with too much. I'm too successful, and too many people want my talents. And am I going to have enough time for this and that? So it's a lifetime battle of complementarity, not opposites. And that means surrendering the ego's addictions and going out of the narcissistic reflection back to reflective consciousness, male or female, doesn't really matter.
Uh, and it it seems like an almost at times an almost insurmountable challenge to surrender idealized narcissistic
Well,
fantasies.
it's an addiction, and it is if you're playing at it, if you're not going to go all the way, because then you end up compromising. And to me, I'm not torturously. Sometimes would wish I could compromise, but I find that to be a sellout for me at the horrible. I can't get out of it, so I've had to learn to surrender. And this is, kind of like even the Jacob and Esau story, and every culture has had surrender to it except Western culture, which kills the lunar or the wave or the field and just dominates with the solar inflated ego. So yeah, it's a tough deal, but it's worth it to fight the battle there rather than to fight the addiction, which will keep you in repetitive addiction and the same old thing of what's not working. I have too much this, not enough that. And you can't get there unless you really surrender and do it as a lifestyle, not just as a material event to get what the new car you want or the new relationship. That won't get you there. It might
The
get you
secret.
there. Yeah, right.
Well, it
Anyway,
um I mean there's what's really interesting is there's so much wisdom in this alchemical approach that's really practical. I mean, just, there's one I remember before a meeting I had with Cisco Systems, which was, invested in my company. Um, you said to me, just remember that the solar eats the lunar. And if you go in and you're also identifying, not over identifying, but you're really bringing forward your solar, then that's going to relax them. Whereas if you're just there present in the lunar, then there's going to be this tendency to dominate and attack. And it's true. I started using that in board meetings where, I just,
You're
I,
brilliant. You're brilliant in board meetings. I've never seen anybody that, no matter what the circumstances were, the board voted your way. That was almost a problem, and
it
eventually
was
it became a battle. But you were absolutely amazing. If that's what you got from that conversation, it's the
totally
greatest
did.
asset and greatest liability.
Well, but that compliment, I mean, what was really interesting is it's in these metaphor systems, sometimes you do actually recognize that you can't solve the problem. You can't, so, and there's a great example. I'll just speak generally about this, but there were investors, there were board members who were so deeply attached to black and white, right and wrong, up and down,
Binary thinking.
binary thinking, so attached that there just really wasn't a possible outcome besides the outcome that was there, because it was a
Mhm.
power struggle and there probably wasn't magic, any kind of magic that would have changed those outcomes.
That's a deeper discussion that
Yeah.
we never do finish this one.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think it's worth following. It is very, very possible. Now that I'm thinking about it out loud, it is very possible that that was because one thing you also did in a very wonderful, subtle way. I had a company, there's this game technology company where we brought in a new CEO, and I was on board with it. I went along with it. Helped recruit this person. Um, and you essentially did marriage counseling for us. And
Most consulting is.
yeah, most consulting is marriage counseling. Um, and I remember, we would talk offline, we would talk together, and you really use this experience, this arena to continually help me see to what extent I was dominating, bullying, using what I could in that side to gain advantage and be attached to outcomes. And I remember one time you said to me, well, you clearly just haven't hit bottom yet. And I really understood, and it took me way, way longer um, to actually hit bottom. Um, but it's really, I kept, and that was way back in probably 2003, 17 years ago. Yeah, but I had to keep going through these compulsive repetitions, with different people, different faces,
Yeah,
different
yeah,
situations,
yeah.
but over and over and over and over. And
Wouldn't have been so much easier to just surrender 17 years ago and
right.
it happened.
Well, but that's
Because
the thing is you
you know,
don't
both
necessarily,
both of you ended up, it's for your benefit and his that you both separated, as
yeah.
it turned out, because there was no way that he was going to give in or you. And so, and you end up to do amazing things after that. And so, some separations are necessary. And that I think was what wisdom to separate an individual because you did amazing, amazing things after that.
Yeah, no, I see that. And what's really interesting in this is this goes along with the collective unconscious and destiny and
Right,
all
right.
those bigger pictures is that
Yeah,
it really isn't necessarily up to you when you've hit bottom. I mean, it's easy to
right.
say, learn this or learn that, but it keeps taking a bigger
then there's always
and
another
bigger
bottom.
challenge.
Then there's another bottom because if
Yeah,
otherwise you'd be inflated
right.
if there isn't another bottom.
Yep,
I don't
exactly.
know. But you do have to reach bottom to get the focus to take the quantum leap. Usually people won't do it until they hit bottom. I'm so tired of hitting bottom that I try to do it without it. And I think I do better. But still, when you hit bottom, that's when you take the quantum leap. I try to take it without that. Uh, and that helps, I think, help me from having as many bottoms.
Right.
But, it's
Well, that's the cool part of it is that part of the speed to reality is hitting bottom in the moment. Like,
yeah, yep,
okay, I've just entered another power struggle,
right.
and not instead of beating yourself up for getting another power struggle, you're like, okay, I can actually shift this. I
That's
can
the really,
sacrifice my
that
ego in the
agility,
moment.
that agility right there is the art of being able to work with the wave and the particle, where the field determines the particle. But if you stay in two particles battling each other, you don't get to the emergence of the lunar, the wave, or the unconscious in humans. And that right there is the art, that agility that you've
Mhm.
really mastered in
Mm.
amazing ways, more than most people.
Well, so much thanks to
Well,
your help. And it goes back to another story where when we had this, for me, just miraculous experience in the on Sand Hill Road in this
that
very
was
pretentious venture capital environment. Um, you gave me your card. We went out to breakfast the next morning in Palo Alto, and I told you a story about um, a really traumatic experience, but a very, long term one that I really didn't understand clearly why I went through it, what I experienced. And at the end of the story, you said something also very simple and resonant. You said, well, you were possessed by archetypes. And if we work together, I can guide you, I can show you how to be guided by archetypes. And that distinction of being possessed, another archetypal complementary pair of the Senex and the Puer, or the Daedalus and Icarus figures, where, another for so much of my life, I was the Icarus, always flying too close to the sun and winding up in the ocean, and not the Daedalus engineer, getting to the farther shore. And the other complementary pair of the lead and the gold, understanding that the lead
right.
is the shadow, is is the drama. It's all of these dramas
Right,
playing out.
right.
And the gold is the liberation vision. It is the far shore.
Beautifully said. Beautifully
And
said.
to get to the gold, you need the Icarus and the Daedalus.
Yeah,
You
beautifully
can't
said.
shoot down Icarus, and you can't
Right,
just go with the Daedalus. You've
right.
got to let them
It's got both ends.
communicate.
And
Yep.
that's really listening kind of really pragmatically, not, is listen to your intuition. It's almost always accurate. And most people don't trust it or haven't been trained that it's the wisdom voice. Almost always, not
Mm.
always, but way more than not. And who, if you keep that going, you won't be creating as many splits and fragmentations between those two different archetypes.
Well, you do have a practical exercise for that, which is um, taking, and I've shifted it a little bit for me, which is understanding that the gift is almost always inside the wound.
Yep,
That um and so if you open up that wound instead of
yep,
burying it, if you bury it,
yep,
it just creates more shadow material.
yep,
Whereas, you wind up being more reactive, more defensive. But the moment you're wounded, whatever it is,
yep,
wounded by a car accident, wounded by life, wounded by another person, wounded by a memory, as
yep,
soon as you feel that wound, if you the exercise that you showed me was looking for the idealization, the idealized
right,
narcissistic fantasy, the belief, and then putting it in a balloon, inflating it,
right,
popping it, and
right,
then just listening for that inner voice, listening for
right,
that
right,
wisdom that'll come from that,
right.
and then take a stand, make a choice from that.
Yeah, you got a great memory for all these little pieces. And that's an important one, is that almost always the crash is because it didn't meet your idealized expectation. And that to really grab that and burn it up, some people send it on a conveyor belt to God. So I've had people, my thing has been putting in a balloon and popping it. But if you then listen to your intuition right afterwards and take action on it, embody it, almost always it'll turn you into an action principle where then you have to watch for the next idealization. And the less you idealize, the more you listen to your intuition, and then it becomes the guide leader. As I think, isn't that what you call it, the guide leader?
Yeah, the leader guide leader.
Leader
Yeah.
God, it's that twinning right there that has the unconscious and the ego operating as partners and dancers together, whether male or female. Here's two men talking about male stuff. The same mirror in women's mythology. You can see in the twinning, and the best one I love is Inanna and Ereshkigal in Sumerian cultures. You have Demeter and Persephone. You have all these dual pairs, but we've not been trained to look for the two-ness. We've been only learned to identify with one, the singularity. Ironically, the singularity is actually two-ness, which they don't
Mm.
tell you because they don't really know. Because the radiation that came out was wave and particle, was field and particle. And that created the universe and eventually humans. And the big thing I learned the other day is when the Earth was born. So the Big Bang happened about 13.8 billion years ago. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth and the Sun were born. And then 4.2 billion years ago, we began to have some cellular dynamics. And by 3.5, it was pretty much bacterial cells were beginning to emerge and so forth and so on. But the other thing that happened right when the Earth was born in this epoch, in that era, is that black matter began to happen. It didn't happen before that era, that epoch they call it. And that to me is amazing that all this mystery of the black matter that nobody understands, and the quantum physicists say something happened when the Earth at that era was born globally that's created the expansion of the universe at this next level that nobody understands, that pull. And so there's something about this era that the Earth and humans and animals were born in this, let's say, this planet, and who knows how many other planets are affected in their own way by that, is still going on. And now we don't have to be victims of the solar, whether it was the men under the women or the women under the men. There's always been a dominant of genders. Now that won't go. And whether there's a battle that never ends between men and women, or gay men with gay men, or gay, lesbian women, who knows, where the battles is personal. And to really go for the humanoid, human level rather than the gender level or the cultural level, that opportunity is there now as modern information is amazing if you take and execute it and realize you don't have to be the victim anymore of culture or even biology to as much as we've had to. Biology ultimately rules, but there's so much more empowerment that this we can have as humans to affect us relationships on the planet that
Mm.
really are required for it to go on in some form other than machine form, which will definitely take over soon if we don't also twin with that.
Yeah. Well, the image that just came to me as you were speaking is this being the age of the spectrum. And
Yeah,
the spectrum is really where the wave and the particle come together. You have
yeah,
the lunar of the rain and the solar of the sun, and things like gender being a spectrum, which
yeah.
it didn't used to be. People thought of gender as binary, and now it's very clear that
That's the
gender
rainbow
is a
path.
spectrum.
That's the
What's that?
rainbow path. Well, that's the
Yeah,
rainbow path. The
beautiful.
spectrum. And all the
Beautiful.
different energies, which we tend to only see one or the other rather than the spectrum, that's really what we're made of, our spectrums and the rainbow path.
Yeah. And the spectrum that goes with that, um, that's very close to my own heart is neurodiversity and neurodivergence, even
Yeah,
talking about the autism spectrum.
yeah,
People really understand that there isn't, the DSM-6 or whatever they're on,
right. It's not a
that binary.
it's not the judgmental system in a spectrum, it's
Exactly.
understanding. And that's a radical difference that affects self-worth, self-esteem, and a battle of opposites that goes on around that rather than the spectrum and the rainbow path. Yeah,
Yeah. The complemented judgment that's been
right.
very powerful for me is discernment is, and the spectrum provides discernment between colors, but also
Mhm.
that range and the overlap and the integration of the colors.
It's the wave and the particle, both
Yeah.
and. If you just have too much lunar or too much solar, you have too much materialism or too much addiction, because the
Yeah.
addiction archetype is the lunar only with no boundaries. Any
Yeah.
addict will tell you they can't have boundaries. You need both and. Yeah.
Mhm.
But
It's true.
spectrum, that's beautiful. That's really the modern opportunity with all of us now, is to live the spectrum consciousness.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, really.
Well, this was quite a journey.
Yeah, really, I have to say, this is the best of the best of us. I
Yeah.
honor you, David, for the amazing presence in my life and so many other people, and how much you've taught me and still teach me in this new phase of your life, which I totally acknowledge you're having surrendered, and the things that are coming out of you to Scobie and all the people you're influencing are absolutely magnificent. And
Yeah.
if I could just say, really, I think your two biggest fans are Four Arrows and myself, besides your wife and your family. And to have us as fans, will humbly say,
Yeah.
congratulations to you, man, for the spectacular Scobie project and the implications of it, and this new way of understanding and being, and so many gifts that you're offering your viewers, and the potential of your team are just magnificent. Really, it's from my heart. You really have something now that the world needs, and I'm so glad you are leading the way with your team to produce this for all of us. We need it badly. I need it. And
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean,
I,
that's my heart is just
yeah,
so full, and
yeah,
that's the
ditto,
foundation of all of this
yeah,
is
ditto.
bringing the gifts that were given to me and share those so much more broadly, and you're really one of those gifts.
Thank you,
So
ditto. I
I'm
feel
sure everybody enjoyed
I
that.
don't have, I don't have I have long-term relationships with a few people, and you're one of them, and that's not going to stop no matter what.
All right.
All
I
right.
love you, Howard.
Hero.
Thank you, Uncle.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Uncle, Grandfather.
Bye.
Bye bye.